Hello, everyone. Welcome to Sleeping Night, where darkness hides incredible stories. Today, we'll dive into a world of mysteries, adventures, and unexpected twists. Get ready for a story that will keep you on edge from beginning to end. If you enjoy the story, make sure to subscribe and give a like. In a dimension that never quite settled into shape, at a point long since abandoned by time, there was a library that no living architect would admit to designing. No kingdom claimed it. No cartographer marked its location. And yet it hovered at the outskirts of every journey, a persistent suggestion at the periphery of reality. The library revealed itself only to travelers who had wandered so far from home that even the gods had lost their scent. It materialized at the edges of sleep, when rest surrendered to exhaustion, or in the precise moment when a storm tore the sky asunder and cast lightning's searchlight across the uncharted wilds. In these moments, the library's spires, like lengths of piano wire, strung taut against the sky, would shimmer into being, black against a hammered sheet of thundercloud. The doors, carved from the petrified wood of trees that had never existed, swung wide at the approach of anyone bearing a question that could not be uttered in daylight or confessed to any priest or king. Inside, the air was thick with the musk of ancient paper and ozone. The corridors wound back on themselves, a labyrinth of ink and shadow, and the shelves seemed to climb forever, vertiginous ladders of knowledge vanishing into the gloom. Each shelf was crammed with books in a riot of sizes and bindings, tomes bound in scaly leather, sheafs stitched with human hair, scrolls wrapped around bones that trembled when touched. But none bore a title or even a hint of subject matter. Instead, each book was branded with a single name, faded, sometimes illegible, as if each volume could only barely remember itself. Occasionally, a shelf would exhale, and the books would shift in place, their spines flexing in a slow, collective sigh. Past the maze of aisles, at the nucleus of the building, the librarian presided over a desk hewn from black oak, polished to a mirror's sheen. He rarely moved, for there was nowhere left he needed to go. His eyes were the shifting gray of smoke, his skin so pale that veins pulsed visibly beneath its surface, as if he was made of glass and memory instead of flesh. The librarian never wrote, yet his hands were always stained with ink, and the scent of it lingered about him, astringent, metallic, and somehow mournful. They said his mind indexed every name that had ever been spoken, from the first word uttered by a primordial throat to the last confession gasped from a dying soldier in a forgotten war. He could summon the precise moment a name was spoken in love, or cursed, or lost to the wind. He had been witness to every secret and every failure, and in the library's silence, he arranged and rearranged the record of all that had ever been desired. It was here, on the night that the comet appeared, its tail a bleeding wound across the sky, that a woman arrived at the threshold. Her boots were caked with red mud, her coat torn at the seams, and her knuckles bore the scabs of a dozen small battles. She entered the library with the reckless momentum of one who had nowhere else to go. The doors recognized the weight of her question and yielded without protest. She hesitated at the threshold, breathing in the peculiar cold that hung just beneath the surface of the heat. Then, with the soft tread of someone used to moving quietly, she made her way past the shelves, past the books that whispered among themselves, toward the desk at the center of the spiral. The librarian looked up, and his eyes met hers, not with surprise, but with the resigned courtesy of a host who has already guessed his guest's intentions. "Tell me," she said, voice raw from disuse. Is there a record of kindness here? Or only of regret? The librarian regarded her for a long moment, as if measuring the gravity of her question, before gesturing to the nearest shelf. And the books, obedient as always, parted to reveal one with her name written on the spine, in script that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. The woman reached for the book, her fingers trembling not from fear, but from the anticipation of recognition. She opened it to the first page, where she saw the story of her life rendered in perfect, excruciating detail. Every cruelty survived, every mercy withheld, every fleeting moment when she had chosen to be better instead of worse. She read until her eyes blurred, then closed the book and set it back in its place. The librarian, who had seen this ritual enacted countless times, waited until she looked up again. "You will find," he said quietly, "that the record is never complete. There is always room for one more page." The night Elara found the place, the comet had already begun its slow traversal of the sky, a wound of fire that bled across the darkness. The journey had been longer than she'd accounted for. By the time she reached the colonnaded threshold, her boots had surrendered to the elements, the laces knotted with red clay, the soft leather separating at the seams. Her coat, once finely woven, was now a patchwork of repairs, each stitch a memento of the roads and hands that had helped her along the way. Elara stopped on the step, catching her breath, the cold stinging her raw knuckles and the bright vapor of her exhalation hanging for a moment before dissolving. The doors were already open, as if expecting her, the light within a weird amalgam of candle glow and phosphorescence. For a moment she hesitated, one foot still in the world she'd come from, the other suspended above the threshold. She told herself this was only a building, only a library, as if that simple premise might shield her from what waited inside. Then she went in, and the world closed behind her. The atrium was vast and silent, the only sound the soft hush of her own breathing. Above her, the roof arched in impossible geometry, glass and stone and something that was neither, latticed together in a pattern that made her eyes ache if she tried to follow it to its conclusion. The walls were lined with shelves, all of them bowing under the weight of books, some so small they could be lost between two fingers, others taller than a child, their spines stitched with precious metals or inlaid with bone. There were scrolls, tablets, even jars sealed with wax, their contents a mystery but for the single word, always a name carved into each vessel. She wandered, half-dazed, along the outermost aisle, running her hand along the shelves. The books bristled as she passed, their spines flexing with the faintest suggestion of animal life. Once, a thin volume shivered so violently it toppled from the shelf, landing open at her feet. She knelt to pick it up, but the pages stuck together, refusing to reveal their contents. She put it back and carried on. At the far end of the chamber, beneath a chandelier that looked like it had been spun from the bones of birds, the librarian sat at a desk studded with the detritus of 1,000 abandoned tasks. Open ledgers, half-empty inkpots, a pair of spectacles with cracked lenses. He was almost exactly as she'd imagined, tall, severe, impossibly old. But the reality of him was stranger than her imaginings, as if he was only partially resolved into the world, a shadow caught halfway between this dimension and the next. His hands, long-fingered and unhurried, moved with the deliberate grace of an embalmer at work. He looked up as she approached, his eyes the stormy color of the sea under cloud. She drew a breath, steeling herself, and offered the question she'd rehearsed 1,000 times in the dark. "I'm looking for my brother," she said. "His name is Tyran. They say he was lost in the war, but nobody could tell me where he—" She stopped, suddenly aware of how irrelevant the rest sounded. "I want to know what happened to him, if he's anywhere." The librarian regarded her for a long moment, then nodded, almost to himself. "Elara," he said, pronouncing her name with the care of someone handling a rare and fragile artifact. "You have come far." The words were neither compliment nor accusation, but a simple statement of fact. She found herself standing straighter beneath his gaze. He rose from the desk, his coat whispering along the floor, and beckoned her to follow. They walked in silence through the inner corridors. The walls pressed close now, the air growing colder and more charged with every step. The librarian's passage seemed to stir the books to attention. They leaned toward him, as if hungry for the nearness of authority. Elara, for her part, could not shake the sensation that she was being catalogued and cross-referenced as she walked. Not just her presence, but her entire existence, her faults, her hunger, her hope, was being weighed and recorded in some invisible ledger. They turned a corner and entered a narrow aisle where the air shimmered, as if refracted through invisible water. The librarian paused before a shelf far above Elara's reach. Then, with a movement so fluid it almost undid the laws of physics, reached up and retrieved a book the size of her palm. He weighed it in his hand for a moment, then offered it to her. She took it. The cover was blank, cool to the touch, and yet impossibly heavy, as if it contained something denser than mere knowledge. She opened to the first page, expecting words, a narrative, some dry recitation of fate. Instead, she found herself staring into a moving image, her own memory, rendered with harrowing clarity. There was the kitchen of her childhood home, sun-drenched and cluttered, her brother, hair falling in his eyes, making faces at her over a bowl of stolen jam. The scene flickered, then resolved into the orchard behind their house, Tyran teaching her how to climb the trees, the scratch of bark beneath her knees. Another page, and it was him again, older now, fingers stained with ink, reading to her from a battered book in a voice as steady as the river in flood. Each page was more than a memory. It was a window, and for the span of a heartbeat, she could feel her brother's presence in the marrow of her bones. She turned page after page, unable to stop herself, even as the images grew darker. Tyran marching off to war, face set in a mask of bravado. The letter arriving months later, creased and water-stained. Herself, alone in a field, calling his name until her voice went hoarse. She tasted the ash of regret, the bitterness of things left unsaid. Then suddenly, the pages ceased to turn. She tried to force them, but the binding resisted, stubborn as granite. Elara looked down and saw with a jolt that the next page was simply missing, a ragged edge where it had been torn away. She looked up at the librarian, heart pounding. "It's gone," she said, voice barely a whisper. "The end. It just stops." The librarian inclined his head gravely. "It is not lost," he said, "only unwritten. You are here to finish what was begun." The moment Elara realized the page was missing, her brother's last chapter, torn away as if by teeth, she felt a rush of ancient panic, like a child waking from a nightmare and finding the world unchanged by her terror. She slammed the book shut, the echo flat in the hush of the library, and rounded on the librarian, whose countenance remained unchanged, as if he'd expected her outrage and found it pedestrian. "Where is it?" she demanded, voice cracking under the strain of hope and dread. Where's the end? You said this place kept every memory, every story. He regarded her with an almost paternal patience, folding his hands atop the desk as if he were about to deliver a lesson she was destined to fail. No library is ever complete, he said, the words as gentle as falling ash. Pages are borrowed, traded, sometimes stolen. You are not the only soul in search of closure. For a moment, Elara wanted to scream at him, to hurl every sharp word she'd ever sharpened against the unfairness of things. But the cold was inside her now, and rage had always been a thinner blanket than sorrow. She stared at him, defiant and defeated, until the silence grew teeth. So what? She said finally, her voice smaller than she meant. You keep us circling, chasing our own tails. What's the point if I can't know how it ends? There is a way, the librarian said. But it comes at cost. He rose, and the bone chandelier above them seemed to flicker in sympathy. With a slow, deliberate motion, he produced a second book, smaller and darker than the first, and laid it on the desk between them. Dust spiraled in the beam of the overhead light, settling around the volume like fallout. You may learn the fate of your brother, but the missing page exists now in another's keeping. To recover it, you must offer something of equal weight. A hot retort leapt to Elara's tongue. What could possibly compare to the last memory of her only brother? But she bit it down. She knew already that the answer was not hers to name. She braced herself, knowing somewhere in her marrow what was coming. What do you want? She asked. His eyes, gray, lightless, regarded her as if searching an index. One memory, he said, without which you cannot live. Not a fact, not a date, a true thing, something that shapes the way you see the world. She flinched, as if struck. There was a ledger in her head, a running tally of all the moments that comprised her. Her brother's laugh, the orchard's sweet rot in late summer, the way sunlight caught in her mother's hair and turned it to molten copper even as the world fell apart around them. The choice was not really a choice. She knew which memory the librarian would take. Do it, she whispered, barely trusting herself to speak. He circled the desk, moving with the hush and inevitability of a receding tide. When he reached her, he didn't touch her at first, simply looked, as if mapping the contours of her resolve. Then, with a gentleness that was almost a kindness, he placed his palm against her forehead. A coldness radiated out from his hand, not the numbness of winter, but the icy clarity of a mountain stream. Elara gasped, and for an instant, the library receded. She was standing on the threshold of her childhood home, the orchard in spring, sap rising, and the air thick with the promise of fruit. Her mother stood at the edge of the field, arms outstretched, her face radiant with love and sunlight. Then the image began to falter, colors leaching out, lines dissolving. Her mother's features blurred, the memory shimmered, resisted, then drained away, leaving only a hollow where the warmth had been. Elara staggered, clutching at the edge of the desk. The cold in her head was quickly replaced by an aching emptiness, a vacancy so absolute it threatened to unmoor her from herself. She reached for the memory, found only a slick, blank surface, as if it had never existed. She shuddered, swallowing a sob, and met the librarian's gaze. He nodded, an acknowledgement, not a comfort. She wanted to hate him, but in the hollow where her mother's face had been, there was nothing left to offer even that. He handed her the second book. Her own name was embossed on the cover, but when she opened it, the pages ran with her brother's story. The last days, the wound, the silence. This time, the narrative did not end in a ragged tear. Instead, it unfolded with an awful clarity. She saw Tyrion on the battlefield, the mud and smoke and the red, sticky permanence of his injury. She saw the moments after, when he realized he would never return home, and how in the private theater of his mind, he replayed every kindness and cruelty he had ever shown to her. She saw him die, not screaming, but whispering her name into the mud, a prayer or an apology. The pain of it hit her all at once, so sharp and bright she bit through her lip and tasted iron. Her tears fell, hard and fast, spattering the page in dark, spreading circles. The book absorbed them greedily, as if each drop rendered the account truer, more complete. When she finished reading, Elara pressed the book to her chest and let herself weep, not for her brother, but for the shape of a mother's face she could no longer recall. Elara moved through the endless, narrowing corridors of the library as if underwater, the weight of her sacrifice pressing against her temples and ribs. Each step she took seemed to pull her further from herself, as if the hollow in her head were expanding to fill her entire body. The books themselves seemed to sense the change in her, their bindings flexed and warped, pages fluttering in sympathetic shivers as she passed. She felt the drag of so many eyes, some remote and indifferent, others keenly interested, trailing her through the stacks. What should have been silence was instead a polyphony, every shelf humming with a low, insistent static. She was not alone in the aisles. She could feel them. Not just the librarian's gaze, though that too was an anchor she could not shake, but the presence of the books themselves. They whispered to her with a new intimacy, the way a childhood home might, exposing her lostness, promising safety, threatening to keep her forever. At first the voices were indistinct, the smudge of a handprint on glass. But as she drifted deeper, they sharpened. She heard laughter, her brother's, but also a dozen others, each laugh with its own peculiar cadence. She heard the wet hiccup of a baby's first cry, the brittle sob of a woman mourning at a graveside, the long, low singing of someone lost in prayer. When she paused to listen, the voices converged upon her, crowding the air with urgent, pleading recognition. It was then she understood, not in the abstract, but in the marrow of her bones, what the library truly preserved. Not just stories, not just memories. The books were not mere records, but vessels, somehow containing the essential stuff of the people they described. She pressed her palm to the spine of one volume at random. A warmth pulsed through the leather, beating in time with her own racing heart. She snatched her hand back and stumbled, clutching her arms around herself, trying to stem the tide of voices rising in crescendo. Some shelves were cracked, splitting open to reveal the raw, luminous matter within. Light bled from the ruptures in pulsing, arterial bursts, and in the illuminated fog she saw faces suspended, flickering like candle flames. Some were serene, others contorted in mid-scream, 1,000 expressions echoing down the length of the aisle. She staggered sideways, colliding with a shelf so ancient it shed splinters at her touch. From between the slats, a thin, trembling voice called her name. It was her brother's. No, not her brother, but something that wore his memory like a mask. Deeper in the gloom, she saw herself. Not as she was now, but as she had been. A pale, flickering echo, pressed like a flower between the pages of her own story. The image was faint, almost invisible, but she recognized the set of the shoulders, the dark tangle of hair, the way her hands twisted at the hem of her sleeve when she was afraid. The apparition raised its face to meet hers, and she felt a chill more profound than any the librarian had conjured. She reached out to touch the glass, and her reflection mimicked the gesture, fingertips aligning perfectly. There was no warmth, only the brittle, icy resistance of the membrane that separated her from whatever fate awaited. The librarian watched her from the end of the corridor, motionless, as if carved from the same substance as the stacks. "You see now?" he murmured. His voice was gentle, but the words dug in with the precision of a scalpel. The library is the only true safeguard against oblivion. Every life, every moment worth remembering, must be anchored lest it dissolve. Elara's mouth was dry, her tongue a foreign object in her mouth. "These people," she rasped, "they're not just stories. You're keeping them here, trapping them." He bowed his head, the lanterns overhead casting bars of light across his face. People are stories. Remove their memories. What remains? A shell. He gestured at the endless ranks of books behind them. Some souls are too precious, too burdened, to be left to the whims of chance. We give them permanence. You erase them from themselves and call it mercy. Elara's voice broke, unfamiliar with the taste of anger after so long gone numb. The librarian's eyes flickered, and for the first time she saw something like regret pass over his features. What is mercy, if not the curation of suffering? We preserve what matters, so that oblivion cannot claim it. The cost is as old as memory itself. She looked down at the book in her hands, the one with her brother's name, and realized she could not remember what her mother's laughter sounded like. She could not remember if her mother had ever laughed at all. There was only the blank, metallic ache, and the certainty that she had traded an irreplaceable thing for a truth that now seemed not just bitter, but monstrous. She whirled on the librarian. "So what happens to the rest of us?" she demanded. "What happens to the ones who get left behind?" His expression, so calm and impassive before, now seemed almost tender. "That is the nature of loss," he said. "To remember is to survive. But to bear the weight of another's pain, sometimes that too is a kind of living." Elara wanted to scream at him, to claw the memory back from within his skull, but her own grief had been dulled at the root, leaving her with only a frayed sense of longing. She looked over her shoulder at the endless shelves, a world of souls, catalogued, preserved, but never free. The magnitude of it threatened to annihilate her. She pressed the book to her chest. Across the aisle, her own ghostly reflection watched with patient, mournful eyes. "You call this preservation," Elara whispered, "but all you've done is build a mausoleum." The librarian inclined his head, as if she had finally understood the lesson he had been waiting for her to learn. "Perhaps," he said, "but mausoleums are built for the living, not the dead." Elara's hand closed around both her book and her brother's, clutching them so tightly the spines bit into her palm. She did not know where she meant to run. Out of the reading room, through the choking corridors, toward whatever feral freedom might exist beyond. But her body was already in motion, legs propelling her on instinct. She barely registered the blur of shelves and the slipstream of air as she sprinted. All she knew was the compulsion to flee, to escape, to preserve the last jagged splinter of herself before the library could devour it whole. But the library was a living thing, and it loved her with the suffocating ardor of a possessive god. The shelves shifted with preternatural fluidity. the very architecture bending to corral her. Stacks that had run straight now curved like the ribs of a whale, guiding her deeper into the belly of the beast. She ducked and weaved, twisting through alcoves and blind turns, but every escape route dead-ended in the same way. A wall of books, breathing, exhaling their scent of dust and memory, bristling with 1,000 unread stories. She heard the voices even in her flight, at first a distant cacophony, then a chorus, then a single voice, her own, echoing back at her from every direction. A door appeared ahead, not the heavy oaken threshold by which she had first entered, but a narrow, trembling aperture rimmed in pale light. She lunged for it, desperate, and was instantly met by the cold, dry hand of the librarian. He did not restrain her forcefully. It was enough that he was there. His presence was a gravitational anchor, warping the laws of motion, making escape as impossible as flight from the event horizon of a black hole. She skidded to a halt, heart hammering, breath burning her throat, and glared up at him with all the hatred she could muster. He regarded her not with malice, nor even pity, but with a resigned, almost familial tenderness. "Do not fear," he said, his voice amplifying in the hush until it filled the entire corridor. "All who seek answers belong here eventually, even I." His hand, cold, immense, inhuman, reached across the space between them. With his other hand, he opened his own chest. There was no blood, no viscera, only the whirring geometry of his ribs and, within, an infinite darkness punctuated by shelves upon shelves, each lined with bone-white books. The air vibrated with the sudden, impossible knowledge that the librarian was not merely a servant of the library, but its first and oldest inhabitant. He was the library, and the library was him. "I was the first," he said. "The first to wish to remember everything." In that moment, Elara saw the truth. She saw the first librarian, young and arrogant, entering the library with a hunger for immortality. She saw him devour book after book, memory after memory, until the boundary between body and archive blurred, until every story had been etched into his marrow and sinew. She saw how, in learning to hoard memories, he lost the capacity to forget, and in so doing became the caretaker of all those souls desperate to be remembered. The library had not claimed him. He had built it, one remembered sorrow at a time. The shelves shuddered. The books began to rattle on their pedestals, an earthquake passing through the quiet order of centuries. The ink in Elara's hand trembled, bleeding through the paper, rising in dark, smoking tendrils that licked at her wrists and face. She tried to let go, to fling the volumes from her, but her fingers were fused to the covers. The words inside squirmed and pulsed, their letters reconfiguring, rewriting themselves to accommodate the new ending she had unwittingly created. The corridor dissolved around her. The walls became a haze of static, then a tunnel of blinding, arterial light. Her own body unraveled, sinew by sinew, until her bones glowed through her skin. Her brother's face hovered before her, younger than she remembered, smiling in that lopsided, infuriating way that always made her want to laugh and hit him in the same breath. He held out his hand, and she took it, and as their palms touched, she felt the hot, liquid rush of all the moments they had shared. The orchard in springtime, the battles on the riverbank, the way he had once said her name as if it were the answer to a question he could never quite articulate. A voice, softer and more insistent than any before, whispered, "Come home." Elara screamed, or thought she did, but the sound was swallowed instantly by the hungry, whirring engine of the library. The ink leaped from the pages and wrapped around her, binding her in a shroud of black script. Every word she had ever spoken, every secret, every regret, braided itself into the air around her. She saw her mother's face, blurry and insubstantial, then gone. She saw her brother's death again and again, from every conceivable angle. She saw herself reflected in the glass, a girl made of loss and longing. Her body buckled. The books in her arms burst open, their pages spinning out in a cyclone, tearing themselves to ribbons. The air thickened until it was almost solid, and through the opaque storm of memories, she glimpsed the librarian, watching her with infinite patience, waiting for the transformation to complete. She did not die, not in the way she expected, at least. There was pain, yes, but it was the pain of being remade, the old self folding inward, vanishing beneath strata of ink and story, while something vast and luminous grew in its place. She became a node in the library's vast network, a beacon pulsing with the currency of memory. She could feel the other souls now, each with their own flavor of despair, their own signature of hope. She felt her brother's presence, always just beyond reach, and for the first time did not grieve, but simply endured, existing in the strange, luminous suspension that was now her fate. The storm subsided, the air clearing in slow, viscous ripples. The corridor returned, but it was no longer a place of terror. The shelves stood stately and silent, filled with volumes that no longer whispered, but simply waited. Elara stood at the center, or perhaps she was everywhere at once, an impossible geometry that made perfect sense here. She looked down at her hands. They were inscribed with lines of text, words scrolling across her skin like veins. She tried to remember her mother's face and failed, but the ache was distant now, a shadow behind the clarity of her new purpose. At the far end of the corridor, the librarian waited. She was changed. The eyes were green, and the hands delicate, familiar. The transformation was seamless. The library had a new custodian now, and the old one faded quietly into the stacks, his own story concluded. Elara, or the new being that bore her name, stood behind the desk. She touched the edges of the two books that glowed on the shelf, hers and her brother's. Their spines shone with a soft, phosphorescent light, the ink inside still wet with the aftermath of their stories. For a moment, she pressed her palm to the covers, feeling the pulse of what remained, then smoothed the parchment with a sense of proprietorship. The next day, a traveler arrived, a scholar seeking knowledge of the dead. He found the librarian waiting behind the desk, as always. But the man who sat there was not the one before. His eyes were green, his voice was soft. And on the shelf behind him, two new books glowed faintly side by side. Many centuries passed, or perhaps only one long day, knotted and stretched by the strange physics of the library. Elara had learned not to measure time by clocks or candles, but by the slow sediment of memory in the halls, by the arrival and arrangement of new souls. She moved quietly through her domain, tracing the pulse of the shelves, tending to the endless work of registration and preservation. But sometimes, in the hush between arrivals, she would feel it. A quiver in the stacks, a faint shudder in the quiet that had nothing to do with the restless dead. It was like a feather brushing the nape of her neck, or a single thread being tugged from the weave of the world. At first, she ignored it. The library played tricks sometimes, and in her earliest centuries she had nearly lost herself within its recursive, hallucinated geography. But the sensation grew more insistent, a gnawing at her mind, until it could no longer be dismissed. Elara began to see evidence of it not just in the air, but in the books themselves. It started with the thinnest volumes, the lives that had barely begun before being snuffed out, the souls whose stories were but a prologue. These books grew paler on the shelves, as if some pigment had been drawn from the paper. Then it spread to the more robust volumes. Teachers, lovers, tyrants, martyrs, all fading in degrees, the boldness leaching out of their spines. This was not the slow, natural erosion of memory. It was abrupt, surgical. Whole chapters vanished. Sometimes in the space between one shelving and the next, a book would lose its title, its author, its history. In rare cases, it lost even the memory of itself. Just a blank, weightless thing, lighter than air and colder than the darkest winter. The first time Elara truly confronted the phenomenon, it was during the quiet hour, the mezzanine's lamps dim and half the galleries lost in shadow. She was calibrating the records, her fingers dancing across the ledgers, when she noticed a gap in section 13, row 8. She did not need to consult the catalogue. She knew the book that belonged there. Auron Vale, A Modest Life, an Unremarkable Soul. A farmer, she recalled, or a poet who had died believing his words would outlive him. Elara remembered her own hands, small and trembling, placing the volume on the shelf. The memory was still sharp. Her first months as librarian, hungry for order, clinging to the certainty of process. Now, when she passed the aisle, the book's spine was so pale it nearly blended with the wood. Not blank, not yet, just faded, like ink left too long in the rain. There was protocol for this. She followed it exactly. She reached for the book. It shuddered. No book had ever recoiled from her touch. Not once. Not in the entire succession of centuries she had occupied this chair. Elara froze, unsure if she should withdraw her hand or press forward. The air around the volume was colder, as if the loss of pigment had sucked the warmth from the atmosphere. She pressed her palm to the spine. A ripple ran through the shelf, like the aftershock of a distant quake. The silence in the aisle was total, a vacuum in which not even the dust dared to settle. Elara pulled the book free. It was lighter than she remembered, and when she opened its cover, she discovered the pages were blank. Not erased, no residue of text, no indentation or smudge. Just a void, white and infinite, a silence so profound it seemed to radiate outward. She tried to recall the contents. A memory of a boy in a field, a line of poetry about rain, a woman with a scar on her chin. But these images were thin and transparent, dissolving before she could fix them in place. She turned the pages with increasing urgency, hoping for a single word, a single letter to anchor her. But the nothingness was absolute. And then, between one page and the next, she felt it, a presence in the emptiness. It was not hostile, not quite, but it regarded her with a cold, meticulous interest. She closed the book, heart stuttering. For several hours, Elara sat at her desk, the pale volume before her, the ink of the library's ledgers refusing to dry beneath her fingers. She tried to reason it away. Faulty binding, a misfiled memory, the natural entropy of the archive. But she could not deny the strange, deliberate quality of the erasure. It was as if someone, or something, outside the library, had begun to forget memory itself. She ran experiments. She took volumes at random from the stacks, opening them to see if their contents were intact. Most were. But the rate of disappearance increased. The older the memory, the greater the risk. She found entire lifetimes reduced to a single blank page. The lives of kings, of saints, of heretics. all equalized by the same erasing hand. She summoned the oldest ledgers, the ones written by her predecessor, and found them altered. Where once there had been a lineage of librarians, now there were gaps, decades unaccounted for, names crossed out as if by the hand of an angry god. Elara, who had believed herself immune to fear, felt a chill rise from her spine to her scalp. She tried writing her own name in the log, just to see if it would hold. But as soon as she looked away, the ink faded to nothing. She wrote it again, harder. Again the page drank the word and left only a seam of paleness behind. She began to realize that she, too, was not exempt. If the erasure continued, there would be no record of her. No evidence that she had ever existed at all. Days, hours, centuries passed. Elara kept vigil over the shelves, monitoring the spread of the white void. She watched as the library, once infinite, began to shrink, folding in on itself as corridors collapsed and wings were forgotten. Sometimes she imagined she could hear the sound of the world outside, the lives whose memories she was meant to safeguard. But always, it was fainter, as if coming from the other side of a thick glass. She tried to summon the librarian, the one who had trained her, but could not remember his face. She tried to recall her brother's name, or the orchard where they had played. But these too blurred and thinned until nothing remained but a longing without referent. She began to suspect that this was not a malfunction, nor a failing of her custodianship, but a message. She opened the pale book and pressed her forehead to its blankness, searching for intent. And she felt a presence, vast, remote, pitiless. It was not a who, but a what. The great forgetting at the end of all things, the entropy that devoured even the memory of memory. Perhaps there was a hand outside the library turning the last page of the last book. Perhaps, after all, eternity was an illusion. Elara looked up from her desk. The shelves no longer stretched into infinity. They ended quite abruptly, in darkness. She wondered what would happen when the last memory was gone. Would she vanish with it? Would she remember what it was to be erased? For the first time since becoming librarian, Elara allowed herself the luxury of doubt. She sat quietly, listening to the silent collapse of the library's world, and pondered the possibility that even this place, even she, could end. It unsettled her, this idea of willful disappearance. It was not oblivion, but the inversion of remembrance, a deliberate act of forgetting, perhaps imposed from without. Was this what it meant to die, truly die? Not to be mourned, not even to be remembered as lost, but to be excised from the history of memory itself. She pressed the Aran Veil volume to her chest, as if by holding it tightly she might anchor both of them against the coming void. But the book squirmed in her grasp, striving to free itself, to join the ranks of the unremembered. She let it go. It hovered in the air for a moment, then drifted gently upward, dissolving into nothing before it reached the uppermost shelf. Elara felt the loss in her bones. She wondered how long it would be before she, too, vanished. And as she sat behind her desk, the last librarian, she resolved to keep working for as long as there were books to be read and memories to be mourned, even if the only reader left was herself. She turned her attention to the fading shelves and braced herself for whatever came next. In the beginning, after the great withering, Elara wandered the remains of the library with the dazed expectancy of someone freshly orphaned. She still dressed each day, still braided her hair, still performed the vestigial rituals of her station. She convinced herself the archives merely slept, that the hush was temporary, that the memory of the world would soon resume its slow, inexorable accretion. but the silence proved absolute. There were no new arrivals, no errant souls in need of registration, not even a stray whisper of mourning to interrupt her rounds. Sometimes she caught herself listing to one side, as if compensating for the vanished weight of the infinity that had once surrounded her. The library itself had shrunk, folding in on itself until the geometry of the place felt more like a wound than a building. Corridors caved and doubled back. Stairwells descended only to spiral upward in an Escherian parody of architecture. The grand vaults were gone. The high galleries collapsed into shallow alcoves. It was as if the library's own nervous system, deprived of stimulus, was cannibalizing itself for want of something to do. Even the dust, once ubiquitous, a fine silt of memory, had grown rare, as if disturbed only by her footsteps. She would run her fingers along the shelves, brushing aside the occasional ghostly residue, and the motes hung briefly in the cold light before settling with unnatural speed. In the old days, the dust would have danced for hours. The air retained a faint tang of ozone, an aftertaste of thunder that lingered long after the storm itself had ceased. Elara sometimes pressed her palm to the bare stone of the walls, half expecting to feel a pulse, some sign of persistence. Instead, there was only the mineral cold, the unyielding fact of nothingness. She wondered if this was what came after memory. Not darkness, but the absence of even the impulse to be remembered. The ledgers were the first to go. She found them one morning splayed across her desk like the bodies of drowned birds, their pages washed blank. The beautiful, infernal calligraphy of her predecessors had evaporated, leaving only the pressure marks where a pen had once pressed down and then lifted away. She ran her nails along a seam of parchment, hoping to coax up a hidden word, a cipher, an annotation that had survived the thinning. Nothing. She let the covers fall open and closed, listening for the old creak, but the sound no longer registered. Her ears, perhaps, had forgotten how to translate it. There were days when she tried to write. She dipped her quill in the last of the library's ink, waited for a memory to rise, and inscribed the name on the page. But always, before she could finish the first line, the ink faded, leaving behind only the watery outline of a letter. At first, she thought this a defect in the medium. She scavenged fresh ink from the abandoned supply rooms, distilled new batches from the withered berries of the memory vines that climbed the empty atrium, but the result was the same. She wondered, was it possible for a memory to vanish before it had even been recorded? Could an entire life be fated for deletion in the instant it was conceived? She clung, at first, to the routine of inventory. Each morning, she walked the remaining aisles, ticking off the volumes in her head, noting which had grown paler, which had disappeared altogether. It was a way of giving herself structure, of pretending that the library still had purpose. But the shelves grew emptier with each circuit, and soon her maps of the stacks were obsolete. The terrain itself rebelled against recollection. Once she entered an aisle in pursuit of a specific book, a diurnal, a particularly stubborn species of memory that resisted erasure, composed of nothing but the rhythms of sunrise and sunset, and found herself stepping into the same aisle again and again, each time with a growing sense of dread. The diurnal was nowhere to be found. The aisle, too, was gone the next day. The library's lamps, which had once burned with a gentle, perpetual dawn, flickered now with no discernible pattern. Some nights, the light would pulse, brightening for an instant as if in anticipation, only to gutter into blue-black shadow. Elara began to sleep with the lamps on, fearing that a total darkness would be irreversible. When the darkness inevitably arrived, it came with no warning, a total, perfect absence, the sensory equivalent of a scream that had been muted in the throat. In those moments, she would grope her way to the nearest shelf and anchor herself by touch alone, lest she dissolve along with the memories. In the absence of work, she turned inward. She tried to reconstruct the old catalogues from memory, piecing together the names and stories she had once curated. It became a ritual of mourning, performed in whispers as she drifted through the shrinking corridors.
Linnea of the Western Wind,
She murmured, holding the remembered image of Linnea's book. A coral pink cover, a torn end leaf, the faint imprint of a bird's claw in the binding.
Father Gerzon, who blessed the harvest, Mara the Reluctant.
For a moment, the names would hang in the air, like soap bubbles refusing to pop. Then, inevitably, they burst and were gone. She missed the company of the dead. In her early centuries, she had resented their constant need for mediation, their endless pleas for commemoration, but now she would have given anything to hear even the most tedious petition. She sometimes caught herself inventing new arrivals, assigning them stories and voices just to stave off the atrophy of her own mind. These phantoms were pale, indistinct, but for a few minutes they gave her the illusion of purpose. Once, she wrote an entire book in her head. The Last Garden, she called it, a compendium of all the extinct plants and the lives that had depended on them, and stored it in the empty space behind her ribs. She knew it would not last, but she repeated the title to herself each morning, until even the shape of the words grew strange and unfamiliar. The library responded to her mourning with a silence that bordered on cruelty. The architecture continued to collapse inward. The shelves, once inscrutable in their order, now curled into fractal spirals, ceasing abruptly at the edge of perception. The final wing, which had housed the most ancient and indelible memories, shrank to a single room. The only book left on its shelf was the volume she had never dared to open. Her own. Its spine was bare, a pale slip of leather with no inscription. She took it down, trembling, and found the pages inside as white and weightless as the blank books that littered the rest of the library. There was no protocol for this. She sat with the book on her lap, waiting for something, anything, to emerge. She tried to remember her brother's face, the orchard of her childhood, the name of the city where she had once lived. The effort left her exhausted, as if each act of recollection rendered the memory weaker, more remote. She wondered if this was how the world ended, not in fire or flood, but in the slow attrition of meaning, a soft erasure that left only the outline of what had once been. Then, one unmeasured hour, the library answered back. It began as a vibration beneath her palm, not the gentle, familiar hum of latent memory that once pulsed through the library's wood and stone, but a resonance unlike any Elara had felt in all her centuries of stewardship. It was the baseline of something ancient, something other than memory, a kind of anti-memory, a wave that reverberated up through the desk and into her bones, making the hollow of her chest ache in a way she had never learned to name. Subtle at first, the vibration grew until it seemed a secret engine was struggling to turn over, cycling, failing, but never ceasing. Elara froze, her mind thrown into a panic both immediate and absolute. Her first thought was that the library itself, stripped of so much meaning and continuity, had finally begun to fail in earnest. She pressed her hand to the desktop and listened. Beyond the low thrum, she became aware of something emerging from the depths, a rhythm, not quite a message, but the seed of one. With each passing second, The impulse sharpened, as if the stone and ink of the library had learned the first syllable of a new language. She leaned closer until her ear touched the cool, dustless surface. The vibration resolved into an almost voice, something that tickled at the edge of comprehension. It was not the voices of the dead, those familiar choruses that once haunted every stack and alcove. This was an altogether different register, as if someone or something were speaking in reverse, spooling words back into raw sound. For the first time in countless millennia, Elara heard something truly new.
Not all is gone.
The voice murmured, a phrase that seemed to fracture as it formed, layering itself until it became a chorus of 1,000 simultaneous whispers.
You listen too high. The archive continues below.
She jerked upright, heart pounding, and looked instinctively toward the boundaries of her world. The library's geometry, always unstable since the thinning, now shimmered as if viewed through a fever. There, in the ruins of the northern stacks, one of the walls had begun to bleed with a glow that was unlike the pallid fluorescence of memory. It was a denser, colder light, blue-edged with gold, veins of illumination worming outward like the roots of a new tree. The wall pulsed, then buckled, as though it had been holding its breath for centuries. Elara approached, her steps cautious but compelled. With each pace, the light thickened, taking on the density of a liquid or a language too ancient to be spoken aloud. She became conscious of the marks on her arms, the inked sigils of her order, the reminders of who she was supposed to be, as they began to shift, quivering in response. Some of the glyphs peeled away from her skin, forming motes of darkness that hovered just above the flesh. She reached out, and the wall's radiance shrank in fear, then surged with renewed purpose, engulfing her in its cold, electric bloom. When her vision returned, she stood in a place that defied all the rules of the library. Indeed, all the rules of space, memory, and perhaps even death. It was as if the library had been inverted, turned inside out. There were no walls, no floors, only an endless, recursive sky with bookshelves hung in the void like the ribs of a long-drowned beast. Volumes orbited these shelves, spinning in decaying ellipses, their covers flickering between visible and not. At the very center of this impossible chamber floated a figure, a silhouette composed entirely of letters. Its edges crawled and flickered, always on the verge of disintegration, yet never quite dissolving. Elara sensed before it spoke that this was not a ghost, not a memory, but something else, an echo of herself, displaced in time and certainty.
You are not the first,
the figure intoned. Its voice was layered, a harmony of her own tone, her mother's, her brother's, and thousands more that she had once catalogued.
You inherited the memory of the world. But what of the stories that were never told? The lives unspoken, the dreams unborn.
Every word landed like a lash. Elara flinched, the accusation more unbearable than any loss she had suffered in her stewardship.
I was the keeper,
she said, and her voice trembled with the effort of memory.
I saved what existed.
The figure inclined its head, or perhaps simply flickered.
And by saving, you forgot what could have been. You bound the world to its past. You remembered so fiercely that nothing new could grow.
Its arms swept wide, gesturing at the spiraling shelves with their orphaned and unwritten books.
You became a tomb, a monument to closure.
Elara's knees threatened to buckle. She staggered forward, compelled to peer over the edge of a shelf that spun by her face. Each book was blank, save for the faint impression of a title, ghostly, half-born. As she watched, a spine attempted to fill itself, letters crowding together, then dissolving before they could form a single name. She looked up.
Then what is this place?
She asked, the question leaving her lips in a rush of air.
The Echo Archive,
The figure answered.
where all that was almost remembered waits to be born. The ghosts of futures untold, the dreams of the forgotten.
Its arms gestured again, and for a moment, the void flickered with possibility. Faces she did not know, stories she had never read, a kaleidoscope of worlds existing only as potential. Elara felt dizzy. She reached for her own arms, grasping at the shifting tattoos, as if to anchor herself to the only reality she had ever known. But the ink was fading, drawn up and out by the gravity of this new place. The figure extended a hand. If the term had any meaning for a being continually dissolving into script.
You have a choice, Elara. You can keep dying with the memories of the world, or you can begin again. Right? Not to preserve, but to create.
Her mind recoiled. She had been built to oppose creation, to restrict herself to the sacred work of curation, of perfect recall. The thought of forging new memory from whole cloth was anathema to everything she had been taught. But the void ached with an absence she had never noticed until it was spoken aloud. The ache of nothing ever becoming, only ever fading. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She studied the books that circled them, waiting for their chance at existence. For an eternity, she had believed that her role was to stand against oblivion. Now, for the first time, she considered that perhaps oblivion was just a prelude, a blank page, not an erasure.
But what if I forget myself?
She whispered, her voice so small it was almost not there. The silhouette smiled, or perhaps this was just a brightening of its letters.
Then you will finally live.
A tremor ran through the void. The shelves shifted, drawing closer together. Elara found herself standing before a pedestal upon which rested a single pristine book, its cover unmarked, its pages empty as a newly fallen snow. Her hands shook as she reached for it, as if some ancient taboo still lingered in the flesh. She dipped her finger in the only ink she had left, her own blood, the line cut by centuries of citation and loss, and began to write. The act felt sacrilegious, exhilarating, terrifying. She wrote not the stories of kings or saints, not the history of old wounds, but something small and inconsequential. A girl standing in an orchard, sunlight glinting off her hair, laughing at a boy who threw apples too high for her to catch. The memory was not hers, not anyone's. And yet as she wrote, she felt the world around her shift, its hunger suddenly sharp and insistent. The void rippled. From the ink grew shapes, then colors, then textures, branches forming above her, the stars beyond them, the scent of crushed grass and ripe fruit. The library, which had spent so long in torpor, began to shudder as if in the throes of birth. Its silence, once ironclad, fractured and became a teeming noise, not the dirge of the dead, but the wild, discordant song of something new. The shelves around her filled with books, each one a possible world, each one a story that had never been, but now demanded to be told. She felt the echo figure's presence recede, replaced by 1,000 new voices clamoring for attention. She wrote until her hands ached and her eyes burned, and with each line, the library bloomed again, not as a mausoleum, but as a garden of invention. And somewhere in the midst of all this tumult, as the air brightened and the shelves reasserted their impossible geometry, Elara heard a voice, soft, young, and achingly familiar. calling her name.